When two police officers handcuffed Camille Johnson, they thought they were detaining an ordinary woman. They had no idea she was a renowned civil rights attorney. Now, standing in a courtroom packed with reporters, activists, and the nation watching, Camille holds the gavel in a case that could expose a system built on unchecked power. But justice isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. Will she deliver the ruling that changes everything, or will the system protect its own once again? Some battles are fought in the streets, others are won in the courtroom. The day had started just like any other. Camille Johnson had woken up early, her alarm chiming softly at 6 a.m. She had a strict morning routine: coffee first, always black and strong, followed by 30 minutes of reading in her sunlit study. It was a habit she had developed in law school, a time carved out for herself before the chaos of the world seeped in. By 7:30 a.m. she was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, ready for a full schedule at the law firm where she worked as a senior attorney. The morning had been filled with client meetings, case reviews, and a particularly frustrating negotiation with opposing counsel in a civil rights case. She had won a major motion that day, forcing a corporation to disclose key evidence in a discrimination lawsuit, a small but significant victory. After a relentless morning in the office, Camille had decided to take a rare break in the afternoon. Instead of heading straight home, she detoured to the local park, a quiet place she often visited, but rarely had time to enjoy. The weather was perfect. Warm sunlight filtering through the canopy of oak trees, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. She had brought a book with her, a dense legal tome mixed with historical accounts of landmark cases, light reading by her standards. She settled onto a bench near the pond, sighing in relief as she leaned back, stretching her legs out in front of her. It was one of those moments where she finally allowed herself to breathe. As she turned the pages, she became lost in the words, letting them transport her to courtrooms of the past, where legal battles had shaped history. Her mind drifted between the pages and her own life, reflecting on the cases she had fought, the injustices she had witnessed. She thought about Bryant v. City of Denver, a case where she had represented a young black man falsely accused of theft. The officers had arrested him outside a convenience store simply because he fit the description. Camille had dismantled their case in court, proving that the arrest had been based on racial profiling rather than evidence. Then there was Wallace v. Harrison Medical, a workplace discrimination case where a black female doctor had been repeatedly denied promotions in favor of less qualified white colleagues. Camille had fought tooth and nail, exposing the hospital's biases. The case had settled, but not before forcing the hospital to change its policies. She had dedicated her life to justice, to holding those in power accountable. Yet, as she sat in the park that afternoon, she was just another citizen, just a woman enjoying a book. Or so she thought. The park was alive with activity. To her left, a group of mothers sat together on a picnic blanket, watching their toddlers play. To her right, an elderly couple strolled hand in hand, their pace slow but steady. A teenage boy was tossing a frisbee with his dog near the pond, his laughter ringing through the air. Joggers passed by at regular intervals, their rhythmic footsteps blending into the background noise of rustling leaves and distant conversations. Nearby, a young woman sat on another bench, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up at the scene before her. She had the look of a college student, sweatshirt, leggings, oversized coffee cup beside her. Camille had noticed them all in passing, but she was too engrossed in her book to pay much attention. That changed the moment she heard the sound of screeching tires. The sharp noise shattered the peaceful ambiance of the park. Camille's head snapped up as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Several people turned to watch as the vehicle came to a stop. Two officers stepped out, both wearing standard-issue navy blue uniforms, their badges gleaming under the afternoon sun. They moved with a practiced authority, scanning the area before their eyes locked onto Camille. A slow, sinking feeling settled in her stomach. The first officer, a tall man with a square jaw and buzzed hair, called out, "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" His voice was firm, but there was something in his tone. Something Camille had heard too many times before. It wasn't a request. She closed her book carefully, placing it beside her on the bench. When she looked up at them, her face was unreadable. "Of course," she said evenly. The second officer, slightly shorter with a stockier build, stepped forward. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Camille arched an eyebrow, her expression carefully neutral. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated. "I'm sitting here, reading." The first officer's gaze flickered to the book beside her, but the skepticism in his eyes didn't fade. "Can we see some ID?" he asked. Camille exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to let it show. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this request?" "It's routine," the second officer said, though his tone suggested otherwise. By now, several people in the park had begun to take notice. A few joggers had slowed down, their eyes darting between Camille and the officers. The young woman on the nearby bench had discreetly raised her phone, angling it as if she was recording. Camille sighed and reached into her bag, retrieving her wallet. She handed over her driver's license, watching as the first officer examined it with unnecessary intensity. "Camille Johnson," he read aloud, as if testing the name on his tongue. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" "I live in this city," Camille answered, her patience wearing thin. "I came to the park to read. Is that a problem?" The officer's jaw tightened. "We'll see." He handed back her ID, but neither of them moved away. Instead, they lingered. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" the second officer asked, his tone edged with something close to mockery. "Are you alone here?" the first added. "Or waiting for someone?" Camille recognized the tactic. It wasn't about gathering information. It was about control, about seeing how she would react. She straightened her posture. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly. The first officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with us," he said, stepping closer. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Camille shot back, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But logic didn't matter. The first officer reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said flatly. Camille hadn't even moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, her voice sharp with disbelief. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone, stepping forward as if to intervene. The young woman on the nearby bench was now openly recording. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, louder this time, as if performing for the growing audience. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. A jolt of humiliation surged through Camille, but she forced herself to stay calm. As the officers led her toward their cruiser, she turned her head toward the crowd, locking eyes with the young woman holding up her phone. For a brief moment, there was an unspoken exchange. A silent plea to document the injustice. The car door slammed shut behind her. Inside the cramped back seat of the police cruiser, Camille's mind raced. She had spent years defending the rights of others, standing in courtrooms, demanding justice, and now she was on the other side of it. The absurdity of the situation struck her. But there was no humor in it. Only anger. And a simmering resolve that this was not where her story would end. The station smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, the air thick with the staleness of long-forgotten justice. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed relentlessly, their harsh glow stripping the room of warmth. Camille Johnson, a woman who had spent years defending others in court, now found herself being processed as a criminal. As the officers led her inside, she took in her surroundings with a lawyer's eye, watching, memorizing, analyzing. She saw other detainees sitting on cold benches, some with weary eyes, others looking resigned to the process. A man in his 20s, his hoodie pulled low over his face, tapped his foot anxiously. A woman with unkempt hair muttered to herself, her arms wrapped tightly around her body as if shielding herself from the world. The officers led Camille down a hallway, past rows of desks cluttered with paperwork, coffee cups, and the occasional smirk from officers who barely glanced up from their screens. Some didn't care. Others saw a black woman in handcuffs and made snap judgments. She had seen that look before. The irony was suffocating. She had spent her entire career standing up for people caught in this system. Yet here she was. "Step up here," the booking officer instructed as they approached a counter. Camille stood tall, refusing to let them see any sign of weakness. "Name?" "Camille Johnson," she answered, her voice steady. "Date of birth?" She provided it without hesitation, her mind already racing through the legal steps she would take next. The officer typed her information into a database with the slow efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Then came the next phase. "Hands out," he said. Camille inhaled sharply before extending her hands. The officer grabbed them, pressing her fingers against an electronic fingerprint scanner. The cool glass surface felt impersonal, invasive. The scanner beeped as it captured her prints. First the right hand, then the left. "You've done this before?" the officer asked, glancing at her. Camille met his gaze. "No." He gave a small, humorless chuckle. "You're calm for a first-timer." "I know my rights," she said simply. The officer didn't respond. He just moved to the next step. "Face forward," he ordered. A camera was mounted on the wall. The red light blinked as the shutter clicked, capturing her mugshot. The same kind of image she had seen in case files over the years. Only now, it was her face staring back. As they led her toward the holding cells, the weight of the situation settled in. She had represented clients who had gone through this. She had heard them describe the dehumanization, the feeling of powerlessness, the way the system made you feel small. But experiencing it firsthand was different. They didn't treat her with brutality, but they didn't need to. The system itself was the weapon. Cold, impersonal, relentless. She kept her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. She would not let them take her dignity. They unlocked a heavy metal door and motioned her inside. "Sit tight," the officer said before the door clanged shut. She was alone now. Camille exhaled slowly and closed her eyes. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Time felt elastic in the cell. Eventually, another woman was brought in. She was younger, mid-20s, with dark circles under her eyes. Her clothes were wrinkled, her expression guarded. Camille glanced at her but said nothing. After a few moments, the woman spoke. "First time?" Camille nodded. "You?" The woman huffed out a dry laugh. "Nah." "Third." "What for?" Camille asked, though she already had an idea. "Shoplifting," the woman said, rubbing her arms. "Cops think I stole some makeup. I had the receipt. Didn't matter." Camille nodded, understanding. She had handled cases like this before. Petty theft charges disproportionately targeting people of color. The woman squinted at her. "What about you?" Camille hesitated for a beat before saying, "Sitting in a park. Reading." The woman blinked. "That's it?" Camille nodded. The woman laughed bitterly. "Damn. They're not even trying to hide it anymore, huh?" "No," Camille murmured. "They're not." An hour later, the cell door opened. A new officer stood there, a younger black man with sharp features and tired eyes. "Miss Johnson?" Camille looked up. "Yes." He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "I know who you are." Camille studied him, waiting. "I read about you in law school," he continued, lowering his voice. "The Wallace case. That was you, right?" She nodded cautiously. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is bullshit," he muttered. Camille raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying that as an officer, or as someone who knows better?" "Both." He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not supposed to say anything, but they didn't even have a real reason to bring you in." "I know." He hesitated before adding, "I'd be careful. They're looking to make an example out of you." Camille felt a cold anger settle in her chest. "They already have." He glanced toward the hallway. "Look, I can't do much, but I'll make sure they don't keep you here longer than necessary." Camille gave a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you." His jaw tightened before he turned and left. Shortly after, another officer opened the door. "You get one phone call." Camille was led to a desk with an old landline phone. The receiver was cold in her hand as she dialed Marissa's number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Camille?" Marissa's voice was sharp with concern. "Where the hell are you?" Camille swallowed hard. "Jail." Silence. Then, "What?" "They arrested me," Camille said, keeping her voice controlled. "For sitting in the park. reading a sharp intake of breath. I saw a video online. I thought maybe they let you go. No. Camille clenched her jaw. They booked me, fingerprinted me, took my mugshot. Marissa cursed under her breath. I'm coming to get you. They're charging me with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer, Camille continued. It won't stick, but they want to scare me. Bastards! Marissa's voice trembled with rage. I'll call every lawyer I know. We'll fight this. Camille exhaled slowly. Marissa, I'm not just fighting for me. Marissa was silent for a moment. Then, softer. I know. This is bigger than me, Camille murmured. I've seen it happen to so many people. I've defended them in court. But now, I feel it. Marissa's voice was fierce. Then we make sure they regret it. A pause. Then Camille said with quiet certainty, I'm going to fight back. Not just for me. For everyone. And in that moment, as she gripped the receiver, surrounded by the cold walls of injustice, Camille Johnson made a silent promise. This was not where her story would end. It was where the real battle would begin. The metal door creaked open, and for the first time in hours, Camille stepped out into the cool night air. The contrast between the station's suffocating walls and the vast openness outside felt almost disorienting. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with fresh air, trying to push away the bitterness clinging to her skin. Marissa was waiting for her by the curb, her arms crossed, her foot tapping against the pavement. The moment she saw Camille, she rushed forward. Camille! Her voice was thick with relief and barely restrained fury. Are you okay? Camille nodded, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. I'm fine. Marissa's eyes narrowed. No, you're not. Camille didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to the station behind her, its glowing sign standing as a symbol of everything she had fought against. This time, the battle wasn't in a courtroom. It was personal. She turned back to Marissa. Let's go. Marissa didn't push. She simply opened the car door, letting Camille sink into the passenger seat before she drove off into the night. As soon as they were a few blocks away, Marissa broke the silence. You're going to sue, right? Camille let out a humorless laugh. They'll expect that. The usual civil rights lawsuit, a few press conferences, a settlement offer. She turned her head to Marissa. That's not enough. Marissa tightened her grip on the wheel. Then what's the plan? Camille exhaled, watching the city lights blur past. I need to think. Marissa glanced at her. Think fast, Camille. The video of your arrest is everywhere. Camille turned sharply. What? It's viral. Marissa pulled out her phone at a red light, showing Camille the screen. A video had been posted on multiple platforms: TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. It had been shared by activists, legal organizations, and thousands of ordinary people. The caption read, Black woman arrested for reading in a park. You won't believe who she is. Camille pressed play. The video showed the officers approaching her, their questions laced with suspicion. It captured the shift from casual questioning to an unnecessary escalation. The moment they grabbed her, accusing her of resisting, the murmurs in the crowd turned to outrage. The camera caught every second, her steady refusal, the tightening of the cuffs, the anger flashing in the bystanders' eyes. The comments were a storm of outrage. She's a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, and they still arrested her? The way they kept pushing for her ID. This is what profiling looks like. Imagine if she wasn't a lawyer. This happens every day to people without resources. Sue them. Fight back. We got your back, Camille. Camille leaned back, letting the reality settle in. This is bigger than me now, she murmured. Marissa smirked. I told you. So, what do we do? Camille looked out the window, her mind already crafting the first steps of her battle plan. The next morning, Camille sat in a conference room surrounded by some of the best civil rights attorneys she knew. Some were old colleagues, others were well-known activists in the legal community. We need to be strategic, said David Calloway, a seasoned lawyer who had built his career suing police departments. A standard lawsuit could take years, and they'll try to bury it in bureaucracy. I don't want this to be just another lawsuit, Camille said, her tone sharp with conviction. I want to push for real consequences. Marissa nodded in agreement. The public's behind her. We should use that. David leaned forward. We have a few angles. False arrest, racial profiling, excessive force. Angela Martinez, another lawyer at the table, added, and with the video evidence, we can hit them harder. Public pressure will help. No way they want to go to trial with this level of attention. Camille considered their words. They'll offer a settlement, she predicted. They'll want to make it go away. David smirked. Of course. The question is, do you want to take it? Camille clenched her jaw. Not unless it comes with real accountability. I don't want hush money. I want disciplinary action, policy changes, public acknowledgement. Angela nodded. Then we push forward. We file the lawsuit. But we also make noise, press conferences, op-eds. We make sure they can't brush this under the rug. Marissa grinned. I like this plan. David leaned back in his chair. All right, Camille. This is your fight. How far are you willing to take it? Camille met his gaze. All the way. That night, as Camille sat at her desk, surrounded by legal documents and statements, her mind drifted back to her past victories. She had stood in packed courtrooms, cross-examining officers who had wrongfully arrested innocent people. She had exposed systemic racism, fought against corrupt institutions, and won settlements that forced change. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't the attorney. She was the victim. She had spent years fighting for others, but now she had to fight for herself. The irony made her stomach twist, but the anger burned hotter. 2 days after her release, Camille received a call from Detective Richard Hale, the department's internal affairs officer. Miss Johnson, I wanted to reach out personally. His voice was smooth, practiced. We understand this situation has gained a lot of attention, and we want to assure you that we take these concerns seriously. Camille smirked. Do you? There was a pause. The department is open to discussing a resolution. And by resolution you mean a quiet settlement? We believe this matter can be handled without unnecessary escalation, Hale replied, carefully choosing his words. Camille leaned back in her chair. Unnecessary escalation? She repeated. Like being handcuffed for reading in a park. Another pause. Miss Johnson, let's be reasonable. No. Camille cut him off. Here's what's reasonable. I want an official admission of wrongdoing. I want disciplinary action against the officers. I want policy changes that prevent this from happening again. Hale sighed. You know that's not how these things work. Camille's voice turned ice cold. That's exactly the problem. Hale hesitated. Look, I can't promise anything, but if you're open to discussion, I'll see you in court, Camille said. Then she hung up. By the end of the week, the city was buzzing. News outlets picked up the story. Activists called for action. Protests formed outside the police department. Camille received messages from strangers across the country. Some shared their own stories of wrongful arrests. Others thanked her for fighting back. She read every single one. And with every message, her resolve hardened. Marissa entered Camille's office the next morning, tossing a newspaper onto her desk. Front page, she said. The headline read, Civil Rights Attorney, arrested for reading while black. Now she's fighting back. Camille exhaled. It's time. For what? Marissa asked. Camille met her gaze. For war. The courthouse was buzzing. Reporters, activists, and community members had gathered outside, their voices rising in chants demanding justice. Posters were held high. Justice for Camille and stop racial profiling, as cameras flashed, capturing the moment. Inside, Camille sat at the defense table, a position she never imagined occupying. She was used to being on the other side, standing at the plaintiff's table, advocating for justice. But today, she wasn't the lawyer. She was the defendant. Her attorney, David Calloway, sat beside her, flipping through case notes. Across the room, the prosecutor, a young, ambitious lawyer named Jacob Reese, prepared to argue against her. His expression was neutral, but Camille knew his type: polished, methodical, loyal to the system. The judge, Honorable Ellen Grayson, entered, her presence commanding respect. "All rise." Camille stood, her chin high. The room quieted. Grayson took her seat. "This court is now in session." The state versus Camille Johnson had officially begun. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss the charges against Miss Johnson," Reese announced. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Camille's eyebrows lifted. She hadn't expected that. Judge Grayson tilted her head. "On what grounds?" Reese cleared his throat. "After reviewing the arrest, the state acknowledges that the circumstances do not warrant criminal charges. We believe it's in the best interest of justice to drop the case." Camille clenched her jaw. They wanted this to disappear. David leaned toward her. "They think dropping charges is enough to keep us quiet." Judge Grayson peered over her glasses. "Miss Johnson, do you wish to contest this motion?" Camille stood, her voice measured. "Your Honor, while I appreciate the state's decision to drop the charges, I'd like it noted that this does not erase what happened to me, nor does it address the systemic issue at play." Judge Grayson nodded. "Noted. The motion to dismiss is granted," she ruled. The gavel struck. The case against Camille was over, but her fight wasn't. The courtroom doors barely swung open before Camille was surrounded by reporters. "Miss Johnson, how do you feel about the dismissal? Will you be taking further action against the officers? What message do you have for those following your case?" Camille held up a hand. "The charges may be gone," she said, "but the injustice remains. This is not over." The cameras flashed. The message was clear. Camille wasn't backing down. That night, the streets of Fort Collins swelled with protesters. Petitions circulated online, demanding police reform and justice for Camille. Organizations reached out, offering support. Celebrities and politicians tweeted about her case, amplifying her voice. She had won the first battle. But the war was still raging. 2 days later, Camille's phone buzzed. It was a notification from the judicial system. A new case had been assigned to her in her role as a judge. She clicked the details. Defendants: Officers Carter and Daniels. Charges: excessive force in an unrelated misconduct case. Her breath caught. The very officers who had arrested her, who had humiliated her, were now standing trial in her courtroom. A bitter, twisted irony settled in her chest. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen. Then she exhaled. Fate had delivered justice to her bench. That evening, Camille met Judge Harold Evans, a mentor and retired federal judge, in his study. Books lined the walls, the air thick with old paper and wisdom. He poured her a glass of bourbon, then leaned back in his chair. "You look troubled." She let out a dry laugh. "Understatement." He raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Your next case is personal." Camille nodded. "It's them. The officers who arrested me." Judge Evans whistled low. "That's one hell of a twist." She leaned forward. "I need your advice. Can I do this? Can I be fair?" Evans studied her. "Do you want revenge?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "I want justice." "Then you already know the answer," he said simply. "Follow the law. Hold them accountable. But don't let this become about you." Camille sat with that thought for a long time. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed: journalists, community leaders, law students eager to witness history. At the defendant's table sat Officers Carter and Daniels. They looked unsettled. Carter's jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against the table. Daniels sat rigid, his eyes flickering toward the bench every few seconds. They were waiting for the judge. Waiting for her. The door to the judge's chambers opened. A hush fell over the room as Camille entered, her black robe flowing behind her. She took her seat at the bench. For a moment, she let the weight of the moment settle. Then she spoke. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat stiffly. Carter swallowed hard. Daniels glanced at his attorney. The realization was written all over their faces. They had once seen Camille in a holding cell. Now, she was the one holding the gavel. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, the state presents evidence that Officers Carter and Daniels used excessive force in an arrest unrelated to Miss Johnson's case. Camille nodded, keeping her expression unreadable. Proceed. The defense attorney, a stiff-looking man named James Holloway, rose. Your Honor, given the unique circumstances, we request a recusal. Camille tilted her head. On what grounds? Holloway hesitated. You have a personal history with my clients. Camille folded her hands. I am aware of that history. However, I have no bias. This case will be judged based on facts and the law. The courtroom buzzed. Holloway pressed on. Respectfully, Your Honor, how can we expect impartiality? Camille's voice was measured, steady. Because justice does not bend for personal feelings, she said. Nor does it excuse misconduct. She turned to the prosecutor. Continue. As evidence was presented, Camille watched the officers closely. Carter, once confident, shifted uncomfortably. Daniels, who had been smug the day of her arrest, kept his gaze down. They knew. They knew that today the power dynamic had shifted. Camille wasn't their suspect anymore. She was their judge. As the hearing drew to a close, Camille rapped her gavel. We will reconvene tomorrow, she announced. The courtroom began to clear. As Carter and Daniels stood, they hesitated near the exit. For a brief second, Carter turned back to Camille. Their eyes met. There was no defiance in his gaze this time, only something that looked like regret. But regret was not justice, and Camille Johnson was here for justice. The second day of the hearing began under heavy tension. The courtroom was packed once again. Activists, law students, journalists, community leaders, and citizens who had followed Camille's case closely. The energy in the room was thick with anticipation. At the defendant's table, Officers Carter and Daniels sat stiffly, their expressions carefully neutral. But Camille saw the signs of discomfort. Carter's clenched fists, Daniels' shallow breathing. They were not as confident as they had been the day they arrested her. Now, they were the ones being judged. The prosecution called Officer Carter to the stand first. He stood slowly, adjusting his uniform, as if it would shield him from the weight of what was about to unfold. The prosecutor, a composed and razor-sharp woman named Renee Caldwell, stepped forward. Officer Carter, she began, her voice calm but authoritative. Can you walk us through the events of the night in question? Carter cleared his throat. Yes. We responded to a call about suspicious activity. When we arrived, we found a male suspect behaving aggressively. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. Aggressively? Could you define what you mean by that? Carter hesitated. He refused to comply with our verbal commands. Camille didn't miss the slight shift in his expression, the hesitation, the careful wording. He was crafting his version of the story. Caldwell didn't let him off the hook. So, you're saying the suspect was actively resisting arrest? Yes. The prosecutor held up a police report. Interesting. Because according to your own written statement from that night, the suspect was already subdued when additional force was used. Carter stiffened. That's not... Caldwell cut him off. Are you saying this official report, filed by you, is inaccurate? Silence. Carter shifted uncomfortably. I may have misinterpreted some details. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Camille remained impassive, but inside she knew. Carter had just exposed himself. Next, Daniels took the stand. His posture was defensive from the start, his arms crossed as if he could physically guard himself from the questions. Caldwell stepped closer. Officer Daniels, did you witness Officer Carter using excessive force on the suspect that night? Daniels exhaled through his nose. Number. The suspect was resisting. Caldwell nodded. Let's talk about that. In your report, you claim the suspect was hostile and uncooperative. But body cam footage shows him following your commands before being thrown to the ground. Can you explain that contradiction? Daniel's jaw tightened. Body cam footage doesn't capture everything. Caldwell's tone sharpened. So you're saying the footage is misleading? Daniels hesitated. Too long. I'm saying it doesn't show our perspective as officers. Caldwell stepped forward. Your perspective? Or your version of events? Silence. Daniels' eyes darted toward Carter, but Carter didn't meet his gaze. Caldwell let the weight of the moment hang before delivering the final blow. Officer Daniels, are you willing to state, under oath, that no excessive force was used? Daniels opened his mouth, then closed it. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Finally, he slumped slightly. I can't say that. It was over. The truth was out. As the testimonies wrapped up, Camille sat in silence, absorbing the moment. She had spent years fighting for justice in courtrooms just like this. But now, it wasn't just about legal battles. It was about what justice actually meant. Did it mean punishing these officers to the fullest extent? Did it mean forcing them out of the police force? Or did it mean forcing them to confront what they had done, to see the cracks in the system they upheld? She thought about the man they had brutalized. She thought about herself, sitting in that park, handcuffed for existing. She thought about all the others, the ones who didn't get their day in court. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. She exhaled slowly, and then she prepared to deliver her verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Camille took her seat at the bench. The weight of the decision pressed upon her, but she bore it with the same unwavering resolve that had carried her through her career. She looked at Carter and Daniels. Their expressions were unreadable, but their fidgeting betrayed their anxiety. She cleared her throat. This court has reviewed the evidence, including body cam footage, police reports, and officer testimony. She let the silence settle before continuing. It is clear that excessive force was used. A murmur spread through the gallery. Camille continued. Officers Carter and Daniels failed to uphold the standards required of law enforcement. Instead of de-escalating the situation, they engaged in actions that led to unnecessary harm. Carter's face paled. Daniels lowered his gaze. Camille inhaled deeply before delivering the consequences. As such, this court finds both officers guilty of misconduct. The room erupted. Some gasped, others nodded in approval. Camille rapped the gavel twice. Order. Then she issued the punishment. Officers Carter and Daniels will be suspended without pay for 6 months. Additionally, they will be required to undergo mandatory de-escalation and racial bias training. Their records will reflect this misconduct, preventing future promotions within the department. She let the words sink in. These are not just symbolic consequences. They are meant to ensure accountability and prevent further harm. She turned her gaze to the officers. This is your opportunity to do better. Carter swallowed hard. Daniels clenched his jaw. Camille's voice softened, but the steel remained. Justice is not just about punishment. It's about correction. The real question is, will you change? She struck the gavel one final time. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Carter hesitated at the exit. Then, slowly, he turned back toward Camille. For the first time, he looked her in the eyes, not with defiance, but with something else. Regret. His voice was hoarse. I didn't think about it back then. What we were doing. Camille studied him. And now? Carter exhaled. Now I see it. He paused. I'm sorry. Camille didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded. Not as forgiveness, but as recognition. Because regret was a start. But only actions would determine what came next. The ruling sent ripples through the city. Some said it wasn't enough. They wanted harsher punishment, removal from the force. Others saw it as a first step. Real accountability within law enforcement had to start somewhere. The community responded. Town hall meetings filled with people demanding policy changes. New proposals were introduced. Mandatory bias training, independent oversight for police misconduct cases. And Camille. She became a voice in the movement, speaking at forums, pushing for systemic reforms. One evening, at a community gathering, an older black woman approached her, gripping her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing up. For all of us. Camille squeezed her hand. This is just the beginning. That night, Camille sat in her office, looking out at the city skyline. She had spent her career fighting for others. Now she had fought for herself. But justice wasn't about one case. It was about changing the system so that no one else had to fight this fight. As she picked up her pen, drafting a new proposal for police accountability reforms, she smiled to herself. Because justice wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure the fight continued, and she wasn't done yet.